welcome everyone. So welcome to Alex's completion seminar. Let's first acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and acknowledge their elders, past and present. When Alex walked up the road from RMIT 4 years ago with a Bachelor of Environmental Engineering in his back pocket and had done some work on air quality modelling and measurement as part of a research project with CSIRO. And as one usually does with an incoming student, offered him a couple of different choices of projects, one of which I sold obviously very well, was a natural extension of the work he'd previously done. We were about to buy some nice, bright, shiny new instruments and instrument an area in regional Victoria. Tools that were well understood, an interesting new place to measure, modeling techniques that were, again, pretty well understood from various regional inverse kind of experiments we've done before. The alternative was to use a model that we'd never used before with a bunch of measurements we'd never used before with an instrument that wasn't flying yet and whose big sister was lying on the bottom of the Southern Ocean. So Alex chose the second one, as you would. And 4 years later, with the award of a CSIRO scholarship, scholarship from Rotary, a Victorian Young Earth Scientist of the Year award from the Royal Society of Victoria, we arrive at today with a spectacular body of work, not all of which we'll get a chance to hear about today. There are wonderful excursions into the field and various other things that we probably won't get to cover because we'll all get hungry if we do. Really nice work kind of on some global understandings of how plant productivity works. Must be a plant thing in the family, I suspect. And really interesting to kind of hear where this work's got to, and I think some pointers as to where it might go next. So Alex, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Peter.
Right, shall I?
Yep. You're right to get back to your seat there.
I think so.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that introduction, Peter. That was great. And thanks everyone for coming along. It looks like pretty much a full house. There's one spare seat down the front. Not sure. Well, I think I'll be happy here to present my PhD work, some of which won't be included in the presentation, as Peter said. There's a lot of work that's been done. Could drag it out to a few hours, but I think everyone would fall asleep before that. So I'll focus on the main theme of the project, which is observing photosynthesis from space. But first I wanted to just give a few thank yous. The University of Melbourne, of course, big thanks goes to them. Most of all to the awesome people over at the School of Earth Sciences and the awesome people here at the college. They've really made the whole experience just much more enjoyable and have given just amazing moral support. A special thanks goes to CSIRO as well for their support throughout my PhD. Also a thank you to the ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate System Science. They've run some great workshops that I've attended. And also the NCI, the National Computational Infrastructure, which is one of Australia's supercomputing facilities, which we've made good use of and burnt a lot of silicon on. But in particular, I want to give a special thanks to my amazing supervisors, Peter and Yingping. They've been really just amazing guides for me throughout this journey. And without them, I would have no doubt been lost in the forest, so to speak. So a bit of an outline of this presentation today. I'll give you a bit of background. I'll then jump into some aims of my research. We'll then look into the research itself, which will be in two parts. The first part is looking at global photosynthesis and what we call information content, which is looking at uncertainties in modelling this and how we can throw in some observed data to reduce those uncertainties. And the second part will actually look at using the data and assimilating it into the model to quantify global photosynthesis. And then I'll give some conclusions and a bit of an outlook on what could be next. So background first off. Well, pretty simple background to start. Photosynthesis, it's something you would have all learned back in school. So plants take carbon dioxide and water, and they use sunlight energy to convert that into sugar and oxygen. So this process right here is absolutely critical process in Earth's system. It is the primary energy source for life. It fuels ecosystem productivity, and it's the basis for our food, our fiber, and our biofuel production. It also happens to interact with Earth's hydrological cycle, Earth's carbon cycle, and Earth's climate. Thankfully for us, it's also been absorbing our carbon dioxide emissions, which has played a critical role in offsetting climate change. So a bit of a look at the land carbon sink. Photosynthesis here at the top is the only way by which carbon is taken out of the atmosphere and put into the biosphere. It's then cycled through plant biomass and can go into soil carbon. And importantly, that carbon that's taken up through photosynthesis can also be released through plant and microbial respiration. So there's a bit of a balance between the sources and sinks. Luckily for us, that balance has been tipped in our favour, to date at least, such that our anthropogenic carbon emissions, some of which have been taken up through photosynthesis and stored in the land biosphere. We can look at this historically. So if we start with atmospheric CO2 concentration back in 1870, it was about 288 parts per million. Then if we sum up all the sources and sinks of carbon over the past about 150 years, we get to an atmospheric CO2 concentration of 403 parts per million. So the land carbon sink there, the one in green, has offset about 25% of our carbon emissions. The ocean has had a similar effect. So it's playing a really critical role for us and providing an amazing ecosystem service. The big question is whether this will continue into the future. So one of the challenges of trying to understand this is trying to quantify each of these individual fluxes of carbon called gross fluxes. The reason we want to do that is because each of these gross fluxes responds differently to climate and CO2 drivers. So in order to predict how this is going to develop into the future, we need to know how each of these gross fluxes responds. At least be able to quantify it up to the present time. So for my PhD, I have tried to quantify one of these gross fluxes, photosynthesis. It's the largest gross flux of carbon between the atmosphere and the Earth's surface. And as I've already shown, it's pretty important in terms of the Earth system. A bit of notation, I'll try and stay consistent, but it's hard. So photosynthetic carbon uptake, we call that gross primary productivity, or GPP. That's often in units of grams of carbon per metre squared per day. It's a rate. You'll also see units of petagrams of carbon. So just for those who don't know, that's equivalent to gigatons of carbon or billions of tons of carbon. So current GPP estimates. So this plot is from a review article from just a couple of years ago that looked at a whole range of different estimates from models and empirical based methods trying to quantify gross primary production across the globe. And the plot that I show here is latitudinal averages. So on the right hand side we have, okay, that's a bit slow to respond, but anyway. On the right-hand side, we have the northern hemisphere. On the left-hand side, we have the southern hemisphere. And here in the middle, we have the tropics. And you can see that the tropics is much more productive as we have, obviously, tropical forests there. What you'll also notice is that there's just a huge spread in model estimates and in all the estimates, sorry. To the point where, for example, over the tropics, you can get a factor of 2 difference between estimates. If you look at this globally, and an average over over a 20-year period, you see that these estimates range between about 110 and 170 petagrams of carbon per year. To put that into perspective, our own annual carbon emissions in 2016 was just 11 petagrams. So these are very large uncertainties. And what's also important to note is that not only is there uncertainty across these models, but there's uncertainties within each model. So the spread could actually be larger than that. So how can we do better? Well, there's a recent, as Peter alluded to, there's a recent new measurement technique that was developed to try and tell us a little bit more about vegetation. So if we think about photosynthesis, the chlorophyll pigments play a really important role. And as they absorb sunlight energy and transfer that absorbed energy through to the fixation of carbon, GPP, there's a very small fraction of that absorbed energy that is actually re-emitted back out from the chlorophyll pigments as chlorophyll fluorescence. And we call this solar induced fluorescence, or SIF for short, and I'll try and use SIF throughout the rest of the presentation. So we can actually now measure this from satellites in space, often from greenhouse gas observing satellites. And this gives us a really amazing proxy of photosynthesis at the large scale. It's considered a bit of a game-changing measurement. Previously, we could only really quantify the amount of vegetation that we see on the land surface, but we had no idea of, we had no measure of how active that vegetation was. Because chlorophyll fluorescence is so intimately tied in with the actual reactions of photosynthesis, it gives us a really good proxy of not just the presence of vegetation, but also the activity, which we've never had before. What does this look like? Well, if we get a chlorophyll solution, chuck it in a flask and look at it under natural light, it looks green, as you'd expect. As it's absorbing the natural light there, it will also be fluorescing. But because there's so much natural light, it just saturates your eyes and you can't see. But if you shine that same solution under UV light, you can actually see this glow. And this glow is exactly what we can measure from space. And this is what it looks like. If you map it for 2 months of 2015, you can see that the SIF is kind of very high in the tropics in January and July, and then you see this kind of greening, this increase in signal in July, which is the summertime up there where you see a lot of growth. How does it exactly relate to GPP? Well, this study looked at a forest site in the US called Harvard Forest, and they took measurements of SIF and GPP, and they found a strong linear relationship, which was also supported by what we saw at the satellite level. So at this kind of forest scale, you have a fairly strong linear relationship. But what's important is that this linear relationship and the slope of that will actually change from ecosystem to ecosystem, and it can actually change under changing environmental conditions. And that's where some of the really important information is that we want to extract. So my aims? Well, the question is, how can we use SIF to better understand GPP? So for my PhD, there's been 3 parts. Come in. The first part is where I did some field work with some people at CSIRO up in a forest in New South Wales. We looked at eucalypts and took measurements of fluorescence and photosynthesis there to try and better understand how these are related at the leaf scale. I've also looked at the Australian continent and looked at using satellite data and models to better understand carbon cycle anomalies over Australia. And finally, I've looked at actually using the SIF data to estimate global GPP. And it's this third one that I'll be focusing on today. So to do this, we'll use what's called model data fusion or data assimilation techniques. So what we do is we use the SIF data to optimize a carbon cycle model, constrain simulated GPP, and reduce our model uncertainties. So we've developed a carbon cycle model which simulates some key processes like GPP, plant growth, and plant and soil respiration in a process-based way. And importantly, it also simulates SIF. So that allows us to compare our model directly with the measured data. That model is called Bethyscope. So we can then compare our model with the SIF observations from the satellites. There's a number of satellites that are observing SIF now, so we can kind of take our pick. And we then combine these in a data assimilation system to optimize the uncertain model parameters, and then we use that to estimate GPP. So what are these model parameters? Well, essentially they represent physical processes that we see in the real world. So they represent things like plant growth, the development of leaves and the dropping of leaves. They represent plant physiology, so the actual reaction rates, for example, that are occurring in the leaves. Things like the composition of the forest canopy, like chlorophyll content. And also other processes like those that affect radiative transfer through the canopy, things like canopy structure. So each of these, I mean, there's a whole suite of different parameters that fit into these four groups. And these parameters will influence either SIF or GPP or both. Because they're uncertain, they also project uncertainties on our estimates of GPP, and that's exactly what we're trying to reduce. So jumping into this research now, we'll look at information content in terms of global photosynthesis. So first things first, before going to the full effort of doing an assimilation of this data, processing it all, doing thousands and thousands of model runs, we wanted to ask the question, actually, will these new measurements improve our estimates of GPP? In other words, will SIF reduce the uncertainty of model GPP? The great thing is we can actually test this before going to the full effort of an assimilation of the data. This is what is called assessing information content of SIF with respect to GPP. A couple of terms that I'll be using from here on are the prior and the posterior. So the prior is essentially our state of knowledge before using the data. So it's kind of our current state of knowledge. And the posterior is our state of knowledge after assimilating the data. So it's what additional knowledge that the data adds. So under the linear Gaussian assumption, the posterior uncertainty of GPP is only dependent upon the prior uncertainty of the unknowns, i.e. the model parameters, which come from the model, the sensitivity of simulated SIF and GPP to these unknowns, which also comes from the model, and the observational uncertainty, which we calculate from the GOSAT satellite for 2010. We do this at a relatively low spatial resolution, as you can see there, which allows us to do quick simulations, and it's okay as long as we handle our uncertainties carefully. So how do we go? Well, this is sort of one of the first plots that we get out of this, and it shows here down on the bottom all of the 53 parameters that we optimize. And on the y-axis, we show the effective constraint, which is essentially the percentage reduction in our uncertainty. It's a bit of an abstract concept to understand, but essentially the higher the effective constraint, the better improvement there is on our state of knowledge. We can see that I've broken this up into 4 classes of parameters. The first is leaf physiology. This one is critically important for simulating GPP. It represents things like reaction rates, as I said earlier. And we see a fairly moderate constraint of these parameters. I'm going to forget about that. Around sort of 20 to 30% at best. So there's limited constraint on the leaf physiology. Leaf growth, so the development of leaves and the death of leaves, we see much better constraint of that uncertainty using the SIF data, up to sort of 60% for some parameters. This also is very important for GPP. Leaf composition, we see the best constraint of its uncertainty, which is largely chlorophyll parameters. The challenge with this is that the chlorophyll parameters influence our SIF quite strongly, but they don't influence our GPP very strongly. So they're what we call nuisance variables. They are sort of sucking a lot of the information from the observations and not translating that onto GPP, which is what we want. And the final little group here is canopy structure, and we see some moderate constraints there. So what about propagating this then onto uncertainty in GPP? Well, in our prior case, we can look at the uncertainty in GPP across the globe. And we see that globally, there's an uncertainty of about plus or minus 19 petagrams of carbon per year, which is about 15%. You can see that the uncertainty is generally larger in the tropics as opposed to other areas. Part of the reason for that is just because the GPP is larger in the tropics. So the uncertainty and the actual values are correlated. So what about after we combine with the SIF measurements? Well, we see a considerable reduction in uncertainty across the globe to the point where our uncertainty in global GPP goes from about plus or minus 19 petagrams to about plus or minus 5 petagrams of carbon. And that means that we're getting about a 73% reduction in our prior uncertainty of GPP using the SIF data. So this is a really encouraging result. We can look at this in terms of the percentage reduction as well. You can see that there are some regional differences here. In particular, you'll see that the northern regions, boreal and tundra regions, you see a reduced constraint of GPP percentage-wise, partly because the observations aren't always, the satellite observations aren't always reaching up that high. So if we look at some specific regions, we can see how this kind of pans out across the year. So here I'm showing an annual cycle of uncertainty or the variance of GPP. And for each month you see 2 columns. The left-hand column is the prior uncertainty and the right-hand column is the posterior uncertainty. And the colors represent the different processes. So we can see that here for a boreal forest region, you see that there's a pretty strong seasonal cycle in uncertainty, which relates to the seasonal cycle in productivity itself. But we see that there's also a bit of a difference in the reduction in uncertainty across the year. So some months you see much larger reductions than others. And the processes which get constrained also kind of vary a little bit. So you can see in the prior case, you see leaf composition can contribute to the uncertainty, but because we're reducing the uncertainty of the parameters so well for leaf composition, we don't see that in the posterior. Again, leaf physiology, there's sort of limited constraint there. Over the tropics, we see less of a seasonal cycle, but we see that there's very strong constraint of the uncertainty across the year. And much of that constraint is occurring through the leaf growth parameters. We also see some okay constraints through leaf physiology, but again, you can see that blue color, it's still there in the prior and the posterior, so it's contributing to the uncertainty in GPP. So what did this tell us? Well, we asked the question whether will these new measurements actually improve our estimates of GPP? Short answer is yes. The uncertainty in global GPP from model parameters can be reduced by about 73%. Some regions do better than others. Most of this occurs through leaf growth parameters. Some of it occurs through leaf physiology, but it's still difficult to constrain leaf physiology using the SIF observations. But overall, this is a very encouraging result. And I'm happy to say that we finally got this published after 13 months of reviews just last week. Part 2, we'll look at actually assimilating SIF data and estimating global GPP. How good's that? So a bit about the setup. Again, we're using our carbon cycle model Bethyscope. We use SIF observations this time from the OCO2 satellite, which is a newer instrument, it's slightly better at measuring SIF. We use a year of data for 2015. And then we use the data assimilation algorithm to optimize the model parameters. And then we essentially use that optimized model to estimate GPP. I wanted to note a couple of things here. The first one is that there are a whole range of different methods that we can use to do the actual data assimilation. There are a whole range of different algorithms. We chose one that makes some assumptions about linearity in the model, and I'll show that that was actually a pretty important thing a little bit later. The second thing I wanted to note is that we found that the model Bethyscope was actually very poor at simulating leaf area, so the sort of density of vegetation. So we kind of cut out that module, and instead we tell the model what the leaf area should be based on satellite measurements. But I'll also show that's quite important later, partly because the satellite measurements themselves are uncertain. Okay, so here we have the observed SIF for 2015 annual mean. And we'll look at the prior case, so the case before we actually do the assimilation. So here I'm showing some model observation residuals, which is essentially a difference between the model and the measurements. We can see that the regions in red are where the model overestimates the measurements, and the regions in blue where the model underestimates the measurements. You'll notice that a number of tropical forest regions, like the Amazon, we're actually overestimating the measurements quite substantially. But what's really important in terms of the data assimilation is accounting for uncertainties as well. So this is what we call mismatch. So this is essentially the residuals here on the left, but divided by the observational uncertainty. And it's this that the assimilation actually focuses on. So regions in red here are where the model is doing poorly, conditional on the uncertainties. So we can see that we were overestimating the measurements here in the Amazon quite strongly. What happens if we take account of the uncertainties is it's actually not that important when you compare it with other regions. So the model is doing not too bad considering the uncertainties. Some regions, like over the central and eastern US, where there's a lot of agriculture, we're doing fairly poorly. Also some regions around Southeast Asia and sort of a few other little patches. So what about after we do the assimilation? Well, this is the kind of change that we see. So I might flip back between the previous one and this one a couple of times just to show the sort of change. So again, this is the prior case. What we want to see on the left is less blue and less red. What we want to see on the right is more kind of pale yellow and less red. And indeed, that is what we see. I was very excited when we saw this. It took a very long time to get to this point, like 2 years, something. Alex Nowles, who was a PhD student here, he said something really great during his completion seminar, which is he flipped between one slide and the next, and he said, there's about 3 years of work in that slide transition. So I'm going to steal that from him. So yeah, this is fairly good. We see reductions in the mismatch and reductions in our residuals. So when we actually optimize these model parameters and then run the model again and compare it with the measurements, it's doing much better. We can look at this in a little bit of a different way by just plotting up on a scatter plot the measurements and the model. So on the x-axis here, we have the observed SIF, and on the y-axis we have the modeled SIF for the prior case. Ideally, we want it to sit on this one-to-one grey line. It's kind of scattered all over the place at the moment, which sort of says it's not doing very well. We can also look at this in a slightly different way, which is looking at a histogram of residuals. So these are normalized by the observational uncertainty again. Essentially, we want, well, first off, if you see large negative numbers here, that means that there's a big difference in the mismatch between the model and the measurements, and that's accounting for uncertainties. If you see very large numbers, there's a big overestimation. So essentially, we want this histogram to kind of get pulled in a little bit. We want it to get closer to a normal distribution. Drum roll. And here's what we see in the posterior case. So we see that with the scatter plot, you see that a lot of those large differences are kind of pulled in quite a bit, but we still see that the model is underestimating a lot of the large observed SIF values, which I'll go into a bit more in a minute. But what's great is that we see that the normalized residuals actually get pulled in quite a lot. So when you're accounting for the uncertainties here, we see a very, very good improvement. For those who know what, for those who know what the chi-squared fit is, we see a chi-squared of about 2.2 in the prior case and a chi-squared of about 1.2 in the posterior case. An optimal value is about 1. I've put a little asterisk next to the posterior here because we're not quite at a point where we're totally happy with it. So it's kind of near a final result, but not quite a final result. And I'll explain that in a minute. Again, the asterisk here, but this is what we see happening to the GPP. So here on the left, we have the model GPP in the prior case, and here on the right is the actual change in GPP that occurs from the SIF data. And we're seeing just a huge increase in GPP across the globe, which is particularly strong in the tropics. If we look at this in terms of latitudinal averages again, we can see that the prior case, which is in the grey, goes to the posterior case, which is in green, and there's a big increase across almost all latitudes. What I'm also showing in this plot is a whole bunch of model estimates, which are the grey lines, and also an empirical based product, which is based on site data, which is in the yellow. Again, the asterisk here is important. There's such a massive increase in GPP here that it's not quite believable yet, but like I said, this is not the final be-all and end-all result yet. So what if we look at just the northern summer, where you see a lot of growth up in the northern latitudes? Again, you see that the SIF data is telling the model that the GPP needs to be a lot higher. We're kind of not too bad in terms of the average of the models up there in the posterior case, but again, throughout much of the latitudes, you see a higher GPP. So why is GPP so large at this point? Well, one of the reasons comes back to our assumption of linearity in the model. So what I thought I'd show here is a few parameters, and this kind of shows how these parameters evolve as you do the assimilation. The assimilation is an iterative process, so you update the parameters, you run the model, you update them again, and you kind of want to come to a convergence point where you get the very best fit with the data, given the parameters. So what I'm showing here are 3 parameters for chlorophyll concentration for tropical evergreen ecosystems, tropical deciduous ecosystems, temperate evergreen ecosystems. The black is our prior guess, and as we go down here towards the dark green, we're getting towards our current posterior. For the chlorophyll, we didn't assume linear model sensitivity. We knew that there was sort of strong non-linearities in there, so we actually accounted for that. And what you see is that the assimilation goes in almost like it jumps, and then the jumps get smaller as it converges. So it's coming to parameter values that it sees as quite good. Compare this with some parameters where we assumed that sensitivity is linear. So in this case, I'm showing some VC max parameters, which are really important for GPP. And we assumed that the sensitivity in the model was linear here. And you can see that the jumps here as it goes from the prior to the posterior are kind of equally distant. So it's not coming to a convergence point here. And we think that this is because of our assumption of linearity. So chlorophyll is really important for simulating SIF. For us, GPP is really important, VC max is really important for simulating GPP. As you can see from these 3 parameters here, we're seeing big jumps in their values, which is essentially increasing our GPP to a point where it's kind of probably overshooting the optimal point. And that's one of the reasons why we see really high GPP at the moment. So some key points. Our final GPP estimate is somewhat still a work in progress. It seems that 4 years is not enough. The assumptions around linearity in the model seem to be biting us a bit. What do we do about this? Well, one solution is just to do more simulations. So we assume linearity because it's quicker to do the runs. So we can just do more simulations and account for the non-linearities. Just burn some more silicon. There's also potential equifinality issues, which is where we see, so we might be getting the right answer for the wrong reasons. Or there might be multiple good solutions to the problem. But based on our fit measures, we're doing quite well. So our chi-squared fit is about 1.2, as I said. 1 is optimal. The solution to this, there's probably a few ways you can address this, but one of the ones I think would be best for us is to just test the model against some independent data. So we're optimizing the model against some data. So we may get a good fit to that data, but for the wrong reasons. So we test that by going and testing the model against some independent data, whether that be SIF or other measurements. A few lessons and improvements. As I said earlier, the model is underestimating a lot of the high SIF values, which we see in the scatter plot and some of these residuals here. One of the reasons for that is because the model is not capturing the seasonal cycle accurately. So if we look here at these two plots, we have the observed seasonal amplitude in SIF and the modeled seasonal amplitude in SIF, the prior case and the posterior case. In both cases, the model is underestimating the seasonal cycle pretty substantially. Use kind of goes up a little bit if you squint, but it's still biting us here in the posterior case. I think that's one of the main reasons why we see the underestimate in the scatter plot up there. We can look at this if we look at particular regions. So if you take the data over, for example, the North African savannah, which is kind of a lot of grasslands and open forest. What I show is the observations here in the black and the prior case in the grey. It's kind of hard to see in this projector, but then we have the posterior case here in the green. We can see that from the prior to the posterior, there's an increase as it's trying to kind of, it's trying to match this seasonal cycle, but there's obviously a big difference there. Another thing that might be influencing this is the leaf area which we prescribed to the model. So we used some satellite data from the MODIS satellite to calculate the leaf area and then give that to the model. What we see here is that the MODIS satellite LAI, leaf area index, has this kind of very similar pattern to what we see in the SIF. So what might be happening here is that the model, because it's prescribed leaf area, it might not have enough room to move to be able to fit the observations. If we accounted for the uncertainties in this and actually let the assimilation adjust the LAI, we might be able to do better. One other possible explanation for why we don't capture the seasonal cycle very well is seasonal variation in our parameters. So we know that a bunch of parameters like chlorophyll concentration and photosynthetic rate, they vary across the seasons. So as times are good, the plants are kind of producing more chlorophyll and they're bumping up their rates. We know that from measured data in the field. We're not accounting that for in the model at the moment. So we can try and build that in. Another little case here is over the Southeast Asia forest, where if you remember, we saw some high mismatches earlier. So in this case, we're actually seeing an opposite seasonal cycle to what the observations are showing. And if you look at the seasonal cycle in the SIF data, in the observed SIF, it's opposite to the leaf area index. And that's a real surprise. And that makes me really question whether this satellite data is good or not over this region. So again, the model can kind of adjust itself in a certain way, but it can't adjust itself enough to overcome this prescribed LAI. So next steps. Well, one of the things we'd like to do is combine this system with other observed data. So at the moment, we've taken in a year of SIF data and assimilated that. We could extend that. There's SIF data going back to about 2007. We could also combine some other interesting measurements like atmospheric carbonyl sulfide. So carbonyl sulfide is something that's routinely measured at a bunch of stations around the world. It's taken up through photosynthesis but not respired. So that can give us another great proxy measurement of photosynthesis. We can then use atmospheric CO2 to get a better handle of the net fluxes. And there's some other data from satellites in particular that could be really useful, like soil moisture and vegetation greenness. And that can help us sort of, if we combine this with the data assimilation system, we can get a real good understanding of how the model's doing and what's happening in terms of the terrestrial carbon cycle. Another thing I wanted to just mention is something we'd like to build into the model. So what I'm showing here is just some measured data over a sorghum crop. We can see PAR here, that's essentially sunlight energy, and FS is equivalent to SIF. And what the researchers did is look at SIF over a period of drought. And we can see in the black here, this is before the drought. You see that SIF relates to radiation in a certain way. During the peak of the drought, the SIF drops quite strongly, indicating that the activity has gone down. And then after the drought is over, it recovers. What's really amazing with this study is that there was no change in the vegetation structure or other kind of measures of the vegetation. SIF shows this response. So it's these kind of short-term changes that are driven by things like drought that really strongly affect carbon uptake and net carbon fluxes. And this can be a really, really important aspect of climate system feedback. So trying to build this in would be pretty critical. A few conclusions. So we've developed a novel observation-based technique for estimating GPP globally. This offers a way for us to now quantify the GPP response to climate. It also allows us to identify model deficiencies, which I showed a few examples of, and improve our predictions. Hopefully it'll allow us to monitor changes in photosynthesis like agricultural productivity, deforestation and drought effects. We estimate with an asterisk 179 petagrams of carbon was taken up through photosynthesis in 2015. And higher than others, but not our final estimate. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you. I'll do the questions.
Okay, because I'm really bad at working out who's stuck their hand up, I'll actually breach protocol and get Alex to handle the questions directly.
Any questions? Malte?
Thank you. Fantastic talk. On the new carbon cycle models that might be part of the system models that go into CMAP6, how many deal with carbonyl sulfide or with SIF?
I'd say none at the moment. So the SIF data from satellites was only, or the first maps, global maps of SIF were only developed in 2011. But we now have data, as I said, going back to 2007. So it's still a relatively new measurement, and combining this with models is exactly what we're trying to do, and a very challenging thing, but really at the forefront. So I think it will get there where people will start comparing their models directly with SIF and trying to combine it to improve their model predictions. But that's kind of happening now. Carbonyl sulfide, in a way, it's even newer. People are only, well, Joe Berry, if you know Joe Berry, only drew up a global carbonyl sulfide budget in I think 2013. So our understanding of that is still kind of limited, and using it to better understand carbon cycle responses is again at the forefront. So it'll come, it'll happen. Not there yet. Jeremy?
In the first part of your talk, you showed there were a bunch of parameters that you considered which had little or no response to, there was little or no constraint from the SIF data. What happened with those when you went forward and were doing the assimilations?
Yeah, good question. I didn't show the parameter constraint in the actual assimilation. They do a little bit better, partly because we omitted the leaf growth module. So that essentially opened up a whole bunch of new information from the observations to be passed on to the model parameters. So they did a little bit better, but we were still only seeing maybe the best uncertainty reduction was 30 or 40%. So still relatively uncertain. Everyone's hungry. Yep.
The agricultural modelling industry spends a lot of time trying to estimate yields and productivity using, you know, micro downscale meteorology. Do you think there's an opportunity to integrate agricultural systems modelling with you know, the data that you're collecting?
Without a doubt. So there's been a little bit of work done already on this. There was a paper in, I think, PNAS a couple of years ago that looked at using satellite SIF data directly as a measure of yield over the US. They found it did much, much better than any of the models could do. So in that sense, it's very encouraging. We could certainly try and use it to better understand yield. Lisa, I don't know if Lisa's, I know Lisa's away today, but she's another student here. She's looking at agricultural productivity over Australia. She's looked a little bit at using SIF. Yeah, I think it's certainly something we can look at in the future. Peter?
Yeah, just a follow-up to that. At least some of the big remote sensing companies think this is an interesting idea. When Lockheed Martin proposed a mission called GeoCarb, which is geostationary measurement that measures greenhouse gases, but also picks up SIF, they sold this as a climate mission. Their interest was in understanding how carbon dioxide and methane are changing in the atmosphere and whether we can attribute sources to sinks. It turns out that most of the interest commercially they've had around that mission is high resolution measurements of SIF, which is not what it's completely a byproduct for them. So it's turning out that there's quite a bit of interest in being able to use this stuff for agricultural and forest productivity.
Yeah. There's also another instrument that's due to fly in a few years from the European Space Agency called Flux. They've developed that essentially for the sole purpose of SIF and using SIF to better understand agricultural productivity. So this instrument will give us really high precision and small spatial resolution data. Yeah, Ellie?
Thanks. Does this take into consideration the oceanic primary productivity? And if not, can that be worked in as well?
At the moment, we don't. So we are only simulating the carbon cycle on the land. I think it'd be great to try and develop this into a sort of whole Earth system model to see and combine this with, for example, CO2, atmospheric CO2 measurements to better understand net fluxes of the land and the ocean. As far as I am aware, nobody's tried to measure SIF over the ocean. I think part of the issue is that it gets attenuated pretty quickly through the water. So you might only see it in really strong blooms, algal blooms. Yeah.
Alex, my question is actually similar. Isn't there attenuation through the atmosphere?
Surprisingly, very little. So just so happens that the wavelengths which SIF is measured, you get very little influence from the atmosphere. The group who was doing this retrieval actually looked at how sensitive they were to clouds as well. One of the big issues of satellite or remote sensing in general is cloud contamination. They found that even in moderately optically thick clouds, you still had over 90% of the SIF signal retained at the top of the atmosphere. So that's kind of incredible if you think about trying to look over the Amazon where it's cloudy all the time. We've had very few measurements over those regions. So this offers a way to understand it over those regions. So, yeah.
how much more time would it take you to be confident that your higher GPP estimate, particularly in the tropics, now allows you to constrain the other model space so that you would even jump to a conclusion saying that those models with higher GPP estimates now in the tropics and elsewhere might even do better in simulating the carbon cycle into the future? Or what are the steps that you are missing in that conclusion?
The first step for us is to account for these non-linearities, so improve the method. That will give us some confidence that we're converging on the optimal solution, so the best fit. Once we have that, we can assess a little bit more the posterior uncertainties in that specific assimilation, so we can look at how the model parameters influence GPP. That gives us an idea of what the model thinks the GPP should be within a certain range. If it turns out that that uncertainty is kind of very small compared to the model spread, then we'll have some confidence in saying that some of these other models are perhaps not so good. I think, comparing the SIF data directly with these other models could be a good way to understand how they're doing. And there's one group who did this in a very simple way, looking at constraining many models using the SIF data. They made some assumptions about how they relate, and they saw that actually the model spread kind of pulls down a little bit, and they saw an increase in tropical GPP, similar to what we're seeing, but not nearly the kind of magnitude. I think then comparing that with any site-based data would be really critical, kind of ground truthing this. So they're kind of the next steps that I see forward. All right, 1 minute to 12.
Beautifully done.
All right.
All right. So again, congratulations to Alex, and thanks very much for everyone for coming.
Thank you.